Hi, welcome everyone. Just seeing the numbers come in. So we'll just give it a minute or two to allow everyone to join. But a very warm welcome to you all. While we're waiting for everyone to come into the room, oh, I realised I haven't changed my name. I'm not Bryony Rose, I'm Becca Pelly-Fry. We'll do that quickly now. I am Public Programme Curator for Watts Gallery. I'm just hosting for today. Good, we've got a good number of participants today, so I think I'll get cracking. So just a little bit of housekeeping before I introduce Ruth. So today this is a webinar, so we can't see you, but you can interact with us. So throughout the talk, if you've got questions that you want to pose to Ruth, please do put them in the Q&A, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. There's a few buttons, there's one that says Q&A. So if you use that one to put any questions in, I can pick them up for Ruth at the end of her talk. Meanwhile, if you have any comments or concerns or any technical issues, you can put that into the chat and I'll be monitoring that throughout. So any issues, just let me know. So I'll just introduce Ruth, who is here to give us a fantastic talk today on the younger Madox Brown. So Dr. Ruth Brimacombe is a freelance art historian and the co-curator of our current exhibition, Uncommon Power, Lucy and Catherine Madox Brown. Formerly the collections curator 19th century at the National Portrait Gallery, where she was employed for 6 years in various curatorial and research roles. She has also worked as an associate lecturer at Oxford Brookes University on a sessional basis. Her other freelance projects include exhibition research for the Jersey Art Museum at the European Impressionists Artists Active in the Channel Islands, writing for the ODNB, Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, and the production of Picturing the News, the Art of Victorian Graphic Journalism, an online exhibition available as an open access resource on the University of Kent's website. This digital exhibition drew on her doctoral research into the pioneering artist reporters from the periodical press who accompanied the Prince of Wales on his royal tour of India in 1875 to 76. Ruth, welcome, over to you.
Thank you, Becca. Well, thank you all for coming today to this lunchtime lecture. And the subject of this lecture is really a continuation of the theme of the first room of the exhibition. So the first section of Uncommon Power is centered on the idea that through Lucy and Catherine, we gain an unusual child's eye view of the pre-Raphaelites, and that in growing up within pre-Raphaelite circles, they received an exceptional upbringing that shaped their later development both as women and as artists. And this was certainly the view of Cathy's son, Ford Madox Huffer, who in his critical assessment of the art of the younger Madox Browns, which is the artistic identity, the name given by the art world to Madox Brown's children when they emerged on the professional art scene. So he put forward the view that they were shaped, that they, as artists, they had been shaped by the circumstances of their birth. He wrote, "Born into a world into which the spirit of insincerity rarely entered, endowed with rare sympathies for the beautiful in this world, their whole trend of feeling and thought was towards the spirit rather than the letter of their art." So there are going to be 3 different aspects to my talk today, and I'll start by just giving you a brief outline of what's to come. So the first part of my talk is going to look at the uniqueness of Lucy and Catherine's experience of growing up as pre-Raphaelites. And essentially, I'm putting forward the argument that in qualitative terms, there is something essentially different to being born into and growing up within an artistic movement, as opposed to making a conscious ideological choice as an adult to become a pre-Raphaelite artist. In this part of the talk, I'll be drawing heavily on the memoirs of Catherine rather than Lucy. There's actually little record from Lucy of her early experiences, but Catherine was persuaded by her grandson, Frank Soskis, to write her memoirs. And she tried to do this 3 times. So there are 3 draft versions for her attempt to do so. They're handwritten, one of which is in the Parliamentary Archives. She was they're a family, they're a great one for nicknames. So Frank actually called Cathy Dadala. And as you go through the talk, you will notice there are lots of nicknames that will appear. So she wrote these retrospective memoirs, and they're useful. They provide a fascinating glimpse, but they are seen through the prism, they're skewed, they're seen through the prism of old age. And they offer us a partial, fragmentary view of her childhood. But I think even so, they provide a valuable insight into what it was like to have Ford Madox Brown as a father. And that's really the question that will be the focus of the first part of the talk. In the second part of the talk, we'll move on to looking at Lucy and Catherine as parents, and to consider in turn the childhood that they offered their children, which was also still heavily informed by pre-Raphaelite ideals. And in this section, we'll be looking at the question of what was it like to have Ford Madox Brown as a grandfather. In order to do this, we'll be drawing on the memoirs of his grandchildren, who were in fact far more assiduous about noting down their memories. So Lucy's eldest daughter was called Olivia, who usually went by the name Olive, and she wrote a memoir called The Anecdotage of an Interpreter, Recollections of a Long Life. And this remains unpublished, so I'm very grateful to one of her descendants who provided me with a copy of the transcript he has made of the manuscript that actually resides in the Columbia University Library in New York. I'll also be drawing on the recollections of Cathy's eldest son, Ford Madox Huffer, who would later become one of the leading modernist authors of the next generation, Ford Madox Ford. He was not only one of the first art historians to write a record of his grandfather's life in 1896, but to date, he is the only one to attempt a critical assessment of his mother, Cathy, and Aunt Lucy's artistic careers in an article he published on the younger Madox Browns in 1897. And in 1911, he also published Ancient Lights, New Recollections, where he recorded his impressions of growing up amongst the pre-Raphaelites and the great Victorian names of the previous century. Slightly later, Cathy's daughter, Juliet Soskis, also published a memoir in 1921 called Chapters from My Childhood, Reminiscences of an Artist's Granddaughter, that recalled her experience of living in her aunt's house and her observation of her grandfather at work in his studio as a young child. And this had a foreword by the journalist A.G. Gardner, which highlighted for the readers the significance of her experience. And I quote, he said, "To have had Ford Madox Brown for grandfather and playmate, to have lived in the Rossetti circle, was to have had an introduction to a life of a quality that falls to few. And though it is not the circumstances of childhood, but the emotional reaction to circumstances, which is the soul of its literature, this record gains from the setting. The picture of FMB in his old age, as seen through the eyes of his little pigeon, has the untroubled beauty of the child vision." So the final section of the talk could be titled Pre-Raphaelites, the Next Generation, as here we'll look at the follow-on activity of the grandchildren and how pre-Raphaelite ideas percolated down through the generations and evolved into modernism. The aim is to reveal the value of Lucy and Catherine's family history in providing a link step between the pre-Raphaelite movement and the modernist thinking that came to the fore at the end of the century. This section will focus primarily on Lucy's daughters, Olive Rossetti Agresti and Helen Rossetti Angeli, and Cathy's son, Ford Madox Ford, and his first wife, Elsie Martindale. So we'll start with a brief biographical overview of the Madox Brown family. So the first thing to note is that Lucy and Catherine were actually only half sisters, and that this circumstance created a fault line in their sibling relationship. Emma was the daughter of Madox Brown's first wife, Elizabeth Bromley, who was also his first cousin, and she'd been a very intelligent and intellectual woman. They had married in April 1843. Sadly, their first child, a son, died after 5 days. So Lucy was their second child, and she was born in 1843. Tragically, Elizabeth was to die of tuberculosis before Lucy's 3rd birthday. But as you can see from these images, Lucy was a much cherished daughter. And Madox Brown, as an artist, is known as his ability to capture very natural images of children. And here he creates these tender souvenirs of her as a little child. He would do this, he would routinely use his children or document his children's growth in this way, but he would also use them as models in his work. So for instance, he used Elizabeth and Lucy as the first models for this genre scene that you see here in the center of the screen, out of town. Though it would actually be completed with other models over a decade later. After Elizabeth's early death, circumstances forced a separation between father and daughter. So Lucy was sent away to board at her aunt's school in Gravesend in Kent, and they later lodged the Rossetti family and received tutoring from Francis and Maria Rossetti. Madox Brown would see her periodically during this period, and he would capture these beautiful images. So we have this exquisitely detailed one of Lucy, which it's called Lucy as a Child with a Rose, and it was painted just before her 6th birthday. It's exquisitely detailed, and it shows quite a feisty character with a very strong, penetrating stare. Then we also have this much more sort of cheeky, challenging image of her age 7 or 8, and this pencil drawing of her with bunches. But both of them are distinguished by the strong sense of her personality, that she's a strong-willed and vibrant character, even at this young age. Lucy had a strong bond with her father, and this would endure throughout her life. So his second marriage was to Emma Hill, who is his model, who came from a farming background. And Cathy, so Catherine was usually known as Cathy, she was born out of wedlock in 1850, and her parents married 2.5 years later. And this was followed by the birth of 2 boys, Oliver, known as Nolly, and Arthur. Sadly, Arthur was to die at 9 months. So, but once again, you see this pattern of him making these very tender images of his young children. So at the bottom, we have these lovely chalk drawings from the Walker Art Gallery of Cathy, age 1.5, and the pencil drawings of her brothers as babies. While the Tate has a chalk of Cathy, age 3. And this looks like it could either be a nostalgic study or a preparatory study for one of his genre scenes. So sometimes the drawings are just studies, and sometimes they're for inclusion in his works. So sometimes it's for sentiment rather than practical purpose. But nonetheless, he always captures beautifully their baby features and their personalities. So famously, he also used Emma and Catherine as the models for his work, showing a mother in 18th century dress holding her child while feeding the lambs in the work known as the Pretty Labar Lambs. So in the exhibition, we have the smaller version of this work from the Ashmolean. The Birmingham Museum of Art has the full-scale scene. And the significance of this work, it was the first time that the figures, Madox Brown painted figures outside, so in the bright sunshine, following through this idea of painting outdoors. And so he was painting in the heat of the sun. Now, Catherine, in her memoirs, recalls, she has a memory of being present while this painting was made. She says, "I remember my father was in the fields one day before our house in Finchley. He was doing a sketch of a picture which was afterwards popular, called the Pretty Bar Lambs. He had a palette. My mother was standing in front of the picture with myself in her arms. Although I was really only a few months old in the picture, I was in reality about 3. I must have been. I don't know what became of the picture afterwards. It was sold. I remember seeing many pretty bar lambs frisking about with the same red-cheeked maid in the background." But actually, we know this has to be a received memory because the timings don't add up, because clearly in the painting, she's a much younger child. But it does speak to how, we know from the artists that these were, to paint this work, it was involved a series of very painfully hot and chaotic painting sessions where the lambs were brought in to create the scene. And it seems to have been an experience that had entered into family lore, to become a legend in family memory. Catherine's memoirs largely relate to her early childhood, and one thing she does recall is her sense of being eclipsed by the arrival of a son, Oliver, and Madox Brown's evident preference for his son. So in one of the versions of her memoirs, she writes, "Somewhere about that time, a little brother appeared. I was about 3 years old. And from that time, I was relegated to the background of things in general. My father was delighted to have a son. He did not care for girls, he always said." And in another version, she writes, I was not much better when Oliver came to town, as my father did not care for girls and had wanted a boy for years. But even my half-sister liked him, although she could not bear me. And when she came to see us, sometimes used to push me aside and call me a nasty little brat. She did not approve of my father having married again, and that only a farmer's daughter, forgetting that her family, my father's cousins, were also farmers' children. However, that time has long passed, but to me, even now, the memory rankles. So this account also lifts the lid on the nature of the relationship between the half-sisters, which, as you can see in childhood, was sometimes quite cantankerous. But this is how the elderly Catherine recalls their relationship. But when you read between the lines, they must have been closer as adult women, particularly when they were bringing up young children in close proximity. There was about 7 years between them, and Cathy suggests that they first met when Lucy was about 13, though again, this could be an erroneous memory. But as revealed by the anecdote, the difference in the class and educational backgrounds of their mothers became an underlying source of tension. But despite this, both sisters had good relationships with their brother Nolly, who was evidently a fun, likable character who loved animals, and Cathy, even when criticising Lucy in her memoirs, still felt bound to attest that she had been a remarkable woman. So now we turn to Ford Madox Brown as a father. And this leads us on to Cathy's perception of her childhood and the question of what it was like to have Ford Madox Brown as a father. Her daughter, Juliet Soskis, would record that Cathy had a deep affection for her mother and father. She had loved her mother and father better than anything in the world. And the family circle would provide an ongoing source of artistic inspiration for her, and she retained an interest in family portraiture long after her professional career lapsed. So in this screen, we see one of her first portraits, which was of Ford Madox Brown, seated in the garden. And we can see from the photograph that comes from the Hoofer family album that she's actually managed to capture quite a representative pose, this sort of slightly hunched head forward pose that she's also in the photograph, and possibly the photograph was used to help with the portrait. But she has captured a sense of the sort of slightly brooding figure of her father. In Thinking, this is a painting, a genre scene that's in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art. This actually captures a representation of her mother, who was a very gentle figure, and she's seen in a contemplative moment while she's sewing, a thoughtful moment while she's sewing. And this actually echoes the composition of one of Madox Brown's paintings, Waiting, in which Cathy and her mother had modelled as the mother and child waiting for the news from the Crimea. So you get this mirroring in there between her practice and his earlier works. Cathy kept a family photograph album, which we very fortunately have been able to include in the show. And this album contains images of the friends and the family that made up the family circle. And it provides a fascinating record of the intimates within the family circle and their friends and the wider social circles. So the inscriptions, Frank Soskis, her grandson, records that the inscriptions are in her own hand. And you will note that by this photograph of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, it's obviously been put into a slot that was reserved for someone else before, because he's certainly not Franny Lightfoot. So Madox Brown comes across as a more volatile, but also a fiercely loving parent. And Cathy relates in the different versions of her memoirs an apple stealing incident where she and her little brother go stealing apples from the neighbour's tree. And when the neighbour catches them, he hits out at Nolly with a stick. And when they go back to the home and Madox Brown discovers what has happened, he's furious and he rushes around and he beats the neighbour with his maul stick. And he has to pay £10 to keep it out of the police courts. But on the other hand, all Cathy's references to her mother recall her kind and gentle nature, sentiments later echoed by her own children about their grandmother. So she has a memory of her as pretty and young, picking convolvulus and candy tuft in their front garden. What is unspoken is that Emma is thought to have had a problem with alcohol, which is often suggested as another reason Ford sent Lucy to live with the Rossettis. So These memoirs reveal the simplicity and hardship of her early childhood, but also the happiness. So she recalls, my parents had a very pretty little garden in front of the little house in Finchley, which I remember they were very proud of, and in which they used to work. It was full of candytuft and convolvulus, flowers I always see with pleasure, as they remind me of my pretty young mother, who was always so gentle and sweet. But these memories are tempered by the recollection that, quote, there were hard times very often, and it often happened that I could not go out, as I had no boots to wear. My feet were on the ground, and my parents often found it difficult to make both ends meet. Despite this, the Madox Browns operated an open door for other needy artists. So Cathy grew up surrounded by members of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and their associates who would drop in for conversation and dinner. Visitors, I remember many people coming to Fortress Terrace and supping with my father, or coming in about 9 o'clock and smoking and discussing the world's affairs and the coming of geniuses. And this leads to the question, what was it like for her to grow up in this highly charged atmosphere, surrounded by these charismatic individuals? So Ford Madox Brown was never formally a member of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but in the words of his granddaughter Helen, his work had a decidedly Pre-Raphaelite tendency, and he was both influenced and an influencer of the Pre-Raphaelite movement. In 1848, Dante Gabriel Rossetti had introduced himself and asked for instruction from Ford Madox Brown, and this led to a firm and lifelong friendship, with Rossetti becoming one of his Madox Brown's closest friends. But although she knew him as Uncle Gubby, Cathy's earliest encounters with Rossetti were not entirely favourable. And in fact, one of her earliest memories was of him pulling a frightening face and causing her to run off and fall into some nettles. And when he picks her up, he just advises her to rub herself with lump sugar, which obviously was not successful. And then she records at the end, the name of my tormentor was Gabriel Dante Rossetti, afterwards the famous artist and poet and a lifelong friend of Ford Madox Brown. But her memoirs also reveal the Madox Brown's lively social life with a particular raucous evening standing out. And so she's wakened in the night one evening, and she hears these terrible sounds coming from downstairs. And when she goes down to investigate, she finds her mother, who was sitting with the animals. It seems my father, with whom were Gabriel and William, W.B. Scott, Burne-Jones, Morris, P.P. Marshall, and a few others whose names I don't remember, were imitating various animals at the top of their voices and shouting at the same time. There were also visits to Upton to the Red House, and she had play dates there, and both Lucy and Catherine grew up revering William Morris. For Cathy, it was a magical place where she read Sidonia the Sorceress, fantasized about William Morris enacting the story of the Beauty and the Beast, and she played with the fairy-like May Morris. But she also clearly gained a very strong social conscience from the example set by her parents. So not only did you have this very open-handed policy, where though they were very strapped for cash, they would always help out other starving artists, including people like Holman Hunt, who would visit on Sundays. She recalls in her memoirs, I remember in those far off days, there was always a spare seat for the young artists, literally people who were hard up, a fact which was always more or less the case with my father and Holman Hunt. But she also records incidents where Rossetti and Ford Madox Brown find a girl who, with a baby who was about to commit suicide, who had been seduced and abandoned, so the classic Formula woman, and they help pay for a hotel, and then with Emma's help, the girl is rescued and returned to the safety of her position in the country. So you get this very strong, this very open-handed and generous policy, moral code that's instilled in the children as they grow up. But they also grow up immersed in his art practice, and they were closely involved in it from infancy all the way up to adulthood. We have here, on the left, we see Stages of Cruelty, and Cathy talks about her memories of posing in the studio for this work, with Rossetti as this restive figure beside them, muttering Guggum, his pet name for Lizzie Siddle. So you see, we have, in the exhibition, we have the study drawing that was made, and you can see it would have been a very uncomfortable thing for a child to pose for hours with her arms upraised. But you also, because Madox Brown would return to his works and retouch them in later years, it would actually end up that Cathy's daughter Juliet would also serve as the model for the work. So it was completed in around 1890. So it was actually, yes, her own child who would then become the model for the work. You also have this painting, The Nosegay, which is her, it's a pot boiler work. It was painted literally for people who wanted to buy something pretty, an Incan generator. But in it, she appears as a beautiful young woman picking posies out in their garden. So you see this idea of she's sort of part of this sort of perpetuating of the codes of female beauty that define the pre-Raphaelite movement. And we also have here, Oliver was also involved in being drawn involved in Madox Brown's practice. So this is the English boy. And this is one of my favorite anecdotes from Cathy's memoirs, because it reveals Nolly to be quite a scamp. And she remembers how my father was drawing what to me seemed a very wonderful little head on my brother. It was a little oil head. He was suddenly called out of the room by someone and he went, telling us to sit still till he returned. In the meantime, my little brother Nolly, who had been very angry at having to sit still to be painted, jumped up and licked the paint off with his tongue. The paint was still wet. My father, coming in, saw what had happened, and the result you may imagine. So the other work you have see here, The Last of England, is obviously one of Madox Brown's most famous canvases. And this is a replica version, a watercolor replica version that's in the Tate. And what's interesting about it is that by this point, Cathy was working as her father's studio assistant. So she was actually involved in preparing the ground or doing the preliminary work for the replica that was made for one of his main patrons, George Ray. But so you have this nice circularity of her. She features in the work as the little girl. If you can just see behind the emigrating couple's shoulder, you'll see the little girl eating the apple. That's Cathy. And then you have her actually producing the replica as a grown woman. So this leads on to their transition from models to practitioners. So Cathy was given the choice to receive an artistic or a formal education, and she chose to be apprenticed in Ford Madox Brown's studio. Oliver, who also displayed talent, was receiving instruction from his father as well. And then Lucy belatedly discovered her talents in 1868, and then she joined her siblings in her father's studio. And then they emerged onto the art scene in 1869, and they emerged with a fanfare, with the successful showing of 3 works at the Dudley Gallery, and they were immediately identified as a group and dubbed the Younger Madox Browns. So here you have the portrait of Catherine Madox Brown, which was made by Ford Madox Brown, in which he celebrates her profession as an artist. On her lap, you have the open box, her watercolor box. So it's like her attribute. And then in the center, you have the portrait of Lucy Rossetti, which was made by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, who was by then her brother-in-law, and that was made in 1872, where you see her become, she's painted in the role of the classic pre-Raphaelite beauty. And then we have this photograph of Oliver Madox Brown, which is a platinum print by Frederick Hollier. What's salient about this is Hollier was taking portraits or making photographic portraits of people who are considered eminent. And so even though he's very young, Nolly had already gained this reputation for being a precocious genius. He had started painting at 9 and was exhibiting at 14. So here we have an example of their most successful works, where they were deemed to exhibit uncommon power. And so we have At the Opera, which was Catherine Madox Brown's first work to be accepted by the Royal Academy, where it was hung on the line in 1869. And then we have the tomb scene from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, which is still regarded as, at the time it created a lot of both critical and popular interest. And it's regarded as one of her most successful works. And it was the work that she would actually, even though it was sold at the exhibition, she brought it back and had it in her collection as it inspired her to what she was able to do. And so it was exhibited in 1870 at the Dudley Gallery. But one of the things that Ford Madox Huffer Kathy's son brings up is the issue of what it was like growing up in Ford Madox Brown's shadow, that they had prominence because of their association with their father, but it also meant that their work was read in terms of his influence and his training. And so Kathy's son, who was rather an ambivalent commentator, because he clearly struggled with the burden, as he saw it, of his own pre-Raphaelite upbringing. So he offers a view of their perception of their relationship to their father, which is undoubtedly coloured by his own perception. So he says in the article about the younger Madox Browns, "The children of great men are seldom great," once said a French rival to Oliver Madox Brown. Oliver's answers, still more seldom the children of little ones, if not to my point, came pat enough. The fate of the fair promising three of whom I now write might well seem to show that tantalizing destiny in this matter sided with the spitefully inclined Frenchman, to imply that they didn't quite meet the promise that they exhibited at this point. Ford Madox Brown was preoccupied with Nolly's apparent genius, and he saw him as the golden hope for the family. Nolly's tragic death, aged only 19, was a seismic shock for the family, and we suggest in the exhibition that it was a likely catalyst for the abrupt end of Lucy and Catherine's painting careers, as it coincided with their marriages and a consequential change in their domestic arrangements. William Michael Rossetti, in his reminiscences, would remember Nolly, as we all named him, was a youth of manifest genius and high promise, the centre of his father's hopes. There can be but few youths under 20 recorded in the Dictionary of National Biography. He is one of them. And this was a fact that would be reiterated several times by both Lucy's daughters in their own writings. But this was not the end of the story of Lucy and Catherine's engagement with the art world, as they became the centre of the Fitzroy Square set and became a central part of London's Bohemia. This happened as a result of the rise in the family's fortunes and social status on the back of a successful retrospective of Ford Madox Brown's work at the 191 Piccadilly Gallery, which brought his painting work to popular acclaim. This also coincided with Lucy and Catherine's coming of age, and in their 20s, they took their place amongst the it girls of London's Bohemia. So they became central figures in the Fitzroy Square set, and you see the influence of their upbringing and the environment in which they grew up reflected in the way they dressed, with one of their contemporaries, Laura Hayne Friswell, commenting that they dressed like they belong in a Burne-Jones picture. Also in this period, you get the shift from pre-Raphaelitism to asceticism, and you see the greater influence of this figure, who we see here, the poet Algernon Charles Swinburne, in this portrait by George Frederick Watts, who was another frequent visitor to the family home, and a very influential character in terms of Lucy, particularly Lucy's work. So Catherine married first in 1872, marrying the eminent German musicologist Francis Hofer, who became the music editor for the Times and was described by Ford Madox Brown as being the champion of the music of the future. And this placed Cathy at the heart of London's musical society. And this portrait of her husband, which was reportedly started in the weeks before their marriage, captures the vibrant intelligence of Hofer, who William Michael Rossetti described as being of, quote, very Teutonic physiognomy, brilliant ruddy complexion, brilliant yellow hair, blue eyes radiant with quickness and penetration. So again, using photographs from the family album that Catherine kept, we see the carte de visite of their three children. We see Ford, her elder son, Juliet, her only daughter, and Oliver. And you also see that she included a record of her sort of a maturing appearance over the years, although you start with this one of her as a renowned beauty in her 20s. Ford Madox Hofer would recall the unorthodox and pioneering nature of the household and would remark in Ancient Light how, in the 50s and 60s, there was an extraordinary outcry against the pre-Raphaelite movement. In the 70s and 80s, there was an outcry almost more extraordinary against what was called the music of the future. And he would say how Francis Hofer's support for the music of Wagner had caused controversy and actually put him, he believed, in personal danger at points. We also have a record of the pre-Raphaelite childhood that they enjoyed. Both Lucy and Cathy liked to dress their children in what was known as artistic style. So Cathy made this lovely informal sketch for her two boys dressed in the velveteen knickerbockers that were in fashion at the time. You also see the accoutrements of a late Victorian childhood in the background. So you have the rocking horse, a flag, and a bow and arrow. And then you can compare this with the photograph of Oliver eating sweets, seated next to Harold Rathbone, who was Ford Madox Brown's studio assistant at the time, who went on to found the Della Robbia pottery. So somewhat amusingly, we also have Ford's rather resentful memory of being forced to wear this flamboyant style of clothes. And he writes in Ancient Light, "When I was a very small boy indeed, I was taken to a concert. In those days, as a token of my pre-Raphaelite origin, I wore very long golden hair, a suit of greenish yellow corduroy velveteen with gold buttons, and 2 stockings, of which the one was red and the other green. These garments were the curse on my young existence and the joy of every street boy who saw me." And then turning to the Rossetti family, Lucy married William Rossetti in 1874 when he was 44 and she was nearly 30. So the brother of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, he was the all-important chronicler of the pre-Raphaelite movement. And so she marries into the heart of the circle. And as you see with this photograph of Rossetti by Juliet Margaret Cameron, he was very much part of the spirit of the pre-Raphaelite movement. They were both independent-minded. They shared each other's agnostic and radical beliefs and both supported the suffragette movement. As you see from Catherine's album, they had 5 children: Olivia, who went by the name Olive, Arthur, Helen, and then twins, Mary and Michael. And sadly, the little boy who is on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side of the left-hand page, he sadly died of meningitis at 18 months. From William Michael Rossetti's testimony, it would suggest that Lucy was a passionate but difficult woman to be married to. He wrote of her, "The mean and trivial she despised, her domestic affections were warm, and in motherhood she was most devoted. Her fondness for her father, who reciprocated well, had always been most marked, and continued so, especially in the early years of our marriage. To pretend that no human infirmities mingled with her virtues, or that she and I were never at variance on any point, would be childish. I cherish the remembrance of the virtues, and make the infirmities alms for oblivion." Now we have a rounder sense of what Ford Madox Brown was like as a grandfather, because both Ford and Juliet Hoofer published more comprehensive records of their experience of being pre-Raphaelite grandchildren. Through Juliet's eyes, you get a picture of him as an indulgent grandfather. He gave this description: "My grandfather lived in the house next door to us, but one. He was the celebrated painter F.M.B. He was one of the kindest, gentlest, handsomest old gentlemen that ever lived. Everybody loved him. He wore a blue cloth tam o' shanter when he was at work, and in the winter sat with his legs in a big bag made of fur inside, like those he wore at the North Pole. He called Juliet, so he called her Little Pigeon and welcomed visits to his studio. She remembered that he would, quote, ask her to tell him about everything, and we always did. He loved us all exceedingly, but he was kindest of all to me because my father hadn't very long been dead. Francis Hoofer actually died suddenly in 1889 of heart failure, which meant that Ford Madox Brown had to sort of resume looking after Catherine and her family. So Juliet remembered, when I ran in to see him in the morning, he used to say to me, little pigeon, you're looking very paintable today," and would let me sit with him in the studio while he was working. So from her, we get these very practical observational details of his painting practice, such as his method for painting large-scale works. She remembered how he used to paint on top of a kind of square barrel. It had a big, thick screw coming up out of the middle of it, and on the top of the screw, there was a chair, and when you turned it round, it went up and up till it seemed to going right through the ceiling. My grandfather used to put his tam o' shanter on and climb onto the barrel of a small step ladder and ask someone to wind him up on the chair. That was when he was painting a very big and high picture. So in Kathy's chalk portraits of her mother and father, which she made of them in later age, which were produced around 1887, you can see Ford Madox Brown is wearing the tam o' shanter that Juliet refers to. So you also have in the album two photographs of Juliet Hoofer and Mary Rossetti, carefully labelled as the grandchildren of Ford Madox Brown. And this, you also have in Chapters of My Childhood, in the foreword, in the frontispiece, they reproduced Ford Madox Brown's portrait drawing of Juliet Hoofer. So you see this continuity of the painting of the children and then the grandchildren. Juliet would go on to marry Frank Soskas, a Russian revolutionary. Ford would also provide a lot of information about what Ford Madox Brown was like as a grandfather. And he commented on his preoccupation with genius. He said, "My grandfather had to have geniuses for his grandchildren. Of an evening, he would go through our names in turn, beginning with the young Rossettis. Olive's a genius, Arthur's a genius, Helen's certainly a genius. Then he would begin with my mother's children. Juliet's a perfect genius. Fordy is too, perhaps. But as for Oliver, I can't make out whether he's a genius or mad. I think he's both." That was high praise. That all his grandchildren should be mere geniuses was a commonplace to him, but that the gods should vouchsafe to him a mad genius, that was almost beyond his most private hopes. Madox Brown also had an interest in his grandchildren's artistic education, and there's a letter in the Parliamentary Archives where he's writing to Oliver, and he tells him that for Christmas he's going to send him in his Christmas box. He's going to put in a box of casts so that his mother can help teach him drawing in the way that she learnt drawing from Madox Brown. Then turning to Lucy and what Lucy was like as a mother. This beautiful portrait by Madox Brown captures her in a soulful moment of maternal reverie where she's clasping her firstborn child, Olivia. And it's very apt, as William Michael Rossetti would describe how I have already borne my testimony, and it could not be too strongly expressed, to Lucy's intense devotion for her children, and the delight with which she took in them. Their infant wiles and their gradually expanding minds was no less intense. Lucy and her children would model for her father. So she appears in one of the murals that he was making for the Manchester Town Hall in Crabtree, watching the transit of Venus, AD 1639. And you can actually see that possibly the portrait became a study for this work. If you look at the similarity of what she's wearing, the same sort of unstructured black dress and the white scarf around her neck. The poet Swinburne would write beautiful odes to mark the birth of Olivia. And also in A Century of Roundels, he wrote another to mark the death of her infant son, Michael, which was set to music by Elgar and has become one of the most requested hymns for a child's funeral. They were clearly very progressive and permissive as parents. In some reminiscences, William Michael Rossetti outlines their parenting ethos and how they encouraged their children to think for themselves. He wrote, "Rightly or wrongly, we thought the training of character a more essential matter for our children than the fashioning of their minds to any form of speculative belief, affirmative or negative. This we regarded as being their own affair when they should be qualified to judge for themselves." He also records that Lucy largely took care of their schooling, that they'd had very little ordinary schooling, but instead she did a great deal with careful method and steadfast persistency in personally instructing all the four, and followed a plan which I consider truly sensible, that of bringing into the house from an early date a foreign nursery governess. There were two such governesses, a French lady of the middle class and a German, both of them young, agreeable, fine-looking women. In her memoirs, Olivia Rossetti Agresti would recall her father as being a devoted family man and a quiet revolutionary. She describes how he taught me to love poetry when I was very young by reading me fine poems or Shakespearean plays, which lost nothing in his impressive delivery. He fired me with enthusiasm for all things nobles, among which the French Revolution, as seen from the romantic standpoint of Carlyle or Victor Hugo, and of course the great figures of the Italian Risorgimento, Mazzini, Garibaldi, and the others. He let me, and when I say me, I am speaking also for my brother and sisters, form my own opinions and respected them, relying on a fuller knowledge and experience to correct youthful exaggerations and errors. So after Frank Hoofer's death, Juliet was sent to live with Lucy for a time while Cathy recovered, and Ford and Oliver would spend their school holidays there. So they provide an outsider's perspective on the extraordinary environment that resulted within Lucy's home. And Ford provided the much less generous view that his cousins were, quote, monsters of precocity, and that his Aunt Lucy was an educational fury. But following a similar path to William Morris, Lucy's children's interest in social reform evolved into a belief in anarchism. And Ford Madox Hoofer remembered how, in these young, splendid and stern days, my cousins, the Rossettis, aided, if not pushed to it, by my energetic, romantic art, founded that celebrated anarchist organ known as the Torch. So this press was a serious endeavour. The children took over a failing press and set out to produce one of England's first anarchist journals. They wrote most of the articles themselves, but they also would invite articles from serious writers such as George Bernard Shaw. While staying with her cousins, Juliet remembered becoming a social reformer like them and going on every Sunday to sell the Torch to the crowds at Speaker's Corner in Hyde Park. Olivia attributed their upbringing to their unusual level of interest in political reform. She wrote, generally speaking, the middle-class youngster knew nothing and cared less for the problems from the social conditions and movements I have outlined. But the young Rossettis of the 1890s had grown up in a different atmosphere, pervaded by Shelley, Victor Hugo, and the trumpet calls of French Revolution, and they listened eagerly to the new ideas that trickled through to them from the socialist and anarchist speakers who held forth in the Sunday meetings held in the London parks. It was at these Sunday morning meetings in Regent's Parks, within an easy walking distance of her home, that I and my brother and sister came into contact with the revolutionary movements which had spread from the continent to England. And it was here that they met individuals like Prince Kropotkin, who lectured on the need for mutual aid. William Michael Rossetti, who was slightly embarrassed by his children's activities, but didn't want to restrain them, talked about how anarchism really meant it was about self-government rather than terrorist activity. Helen and Olivia Rossetti would write A Girl Among the Anarchists using the pseudonym Isabel Meredith, which provides a semi-autobiographical record of their involvement in the journal and the anarchist movement. And this publication is now of interest to historians of radical history and the feminist movement. In 1897, Olivia ended up marrying a young Florentine revolutionary called Gaston Angeli and settled in Italy, where she remained for the rest of her life. She worked as a nurse during World War I, and in 1918 became an interpreter at the annual assemblies of the League of Nations. And she's seen here in the sketches made of these international conferences in 1927 by Violet Oakley. Here her history takes a Mitford turn in that her unorthodox views led her to become a supporter of Mussolini and fascism, though not of Hitler. And in later life, she would also become a friend of the poet Ezra Pound, and their correspondence would be published in a book called I Cease Not to Yowl. Finally, coming to Cathy's son, Ford Madox Hoofer, who consciously engaged with the weight of his pre-Raphaelite origins and attempted to analyse its effect from a modernist perspective in his memoir, Ancient Lights and New Recollections, and another work, It Was the Nightingale. So here we've got Cathy's portrait of Elsie Martindale in the pre-Raphaelite dress that she made for herself after she married Ford as a young 18-year-old. A sign of her becoming part of the pre-Raphaelite tribe. Sadly, the marriage was unhappy, and Ford, who suffered from depression, would end up abandoning her, though she would sue for the return of her conjugal rights. They had two children, Christine and Catherine, and the tensions in his first marriage would inspire his novel, The Good Soldier, and his other work, Parade's End, would see him become one of the leading modernist authors of the next generation. Ford's, again, he would have early memories of the pre-Raphaelites, and one of his earliest memories is rolling in his cot, surrounded by Dante Gabriel Rossetti's papers that his father was proofing. For him, this pre-Raphaelite legacy was a burden. He talked about it as being oppressive. He describes the younger Madox Browns as being the product of an intellectual forcing house, and relates how he himself came out of the hot house atmosphere of pre-Raphaelitism, where I was being trained for a genius. I regarded that training with a rather cold distaste. But Madox Ford is a conflicted commentator, torn between celebrating the pre-Raphaelite achievements and pointing out their flaws, while still acknowledging his debt to the past. On the one hand, he skewers the pretensions of pre-Raphaelitism and points out the inherent fallacies of the art they promoted. So he wrote, in spite of the Italianism of Rossetti, who was never in Italy, and the medievalism of Morris, who had never looked medievalism with its cruelties, its filth, its stenches, and its avarice in the face, in spite of these tendencies that were forced upon them by those two contagious spirits, the whole note of this old romantic circle was national, was astonishingly English, was Georgian even. They seem to date from the Regency and to have skipped altogether the baneful influences of early Victorianism and of the commerciality that the Prince Consort spread through England. But then he goes on to demonstrate how their pre-Raphaelite training morphed into modernist thinking. He describes in Ancient Lights how pre-Raphaelitism may or may not have been important in the history of modern art, but it was all important in the development of modern thought. And then he gives the example of Millet's painting of Christ in the house of his parents as being important, not so much for how it was painted, but for what it dared to show conceptually. He wrote, the amiable headless of the crinoline period was perfectly right to be horribly worried when Millet exhibited a picture showing Christ obedient to his parents. You have to consider that in those days it was blasphemous, indecent, and uncomfortable to consider sacred passages. No one really likes to think about the Redeemer, and Millet showed the Virgin kissing her son. And so this is Ford Madox Brown's grandson defines the part that the pre-Raphaelites played in the coming of the modern era. So my concluding thought is that it was not so much in their artistic principles as the unorthodox spirit of pre-Raphaelitism that informed the generation that descended from Ford Madox Brown and Lucy and Catherine. In subsequent generations, it evolved into a more literary and ideological form rather than artistic, but they all acknowledge their debt to their pre-Raphaelite antecedents. Now, my last slide is really just a footnote, because Ford and Elsie's second daughter, Catherine, moved to Dublin to become one of the first female students at Dublin's Veterinary College. And there she met and fell in love with and married the Irish nationalist painter, Charles Lamb. So you can also chart a line from pre-Raphaelitism to Irish modernist art. But this is a tale for another day. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth. That was a real sweep. There was so much in there. Amazing. Just a reminder for everybody that there is an opportunity to ask questions. We'll be here for another few minutes. So do put your questions into the Q&A and I'll pick them up and ask them to Ruth. You may need a few minutes to digest. I know that I do, but luckily I had a couple of questions ready. So while you're all thinking, I'm going to ask a couple of questions for Ruth. So the first question is, I guess this is like an opinion really rather than anything else. Do you think it was good to grow up as a pre-Raphaelite?
I think there were a lot of advantages, and I think that they all feel that. They all sort of struggle with that, in that they have this amazing intellectual upbringing, and there's certainly when Madox Brown becomes more influential and rises in kind of fortune and social status, they're placed at the heart of this incredible intellectual social group. But at the same time, it does inhibit their own creativity. So they're sort of enabled by being pre-Raphaelite children, but also inhibited at the same time. And with Lucy and Catherine, because their artistic careers are cut short, it's sort of tantalizing to imagine what might have happened had they been able to grow to their full extent, and to see, you know, how they might have grown, you know, taken their pre-Raphaelite beginnings and sort of turned it into something else. And we see that in the exhibition. There is one painting that sort of, it's a view of Charmworth that Lucy does when she's older. It's after her marriage, sort of, and I think it's about 1879, and it has a more modernist character to it. And so you sort of see how she herself may have become a modernist artist had her artistic career been allowed to develop.
Yeah, really interesting. Am I right in saying that the women never used oil? Is that right?
So it wasn't usual. So it was customary or was expected that women would paint with watercolors. And so that's one of the things that Lucy does differently, is she because she becomes so successful with that tomb scene of Romeo and Juliet, because she's so successful, she it sort of gives her the confidence to then become to paint in oil. And so the next two, she paints Ferdinand and Miranda, which is an oil, and that's a success. And then the last one that she paints is Margaret Roper rescuing the head of her father, Thomas More. And again, William Michael Rossetti talks about how she struggles with the oil because she hasn't been trained in it in the way that her male counterparts might have been, but she's still sort of determined to be able to master the medium.
Well, I mean, it famously takes a long time to handle. So yeah, it's not surprising her first two paintings were a little tricky. While we're still waiting for any other questions to come in, I do have another one as well about the idea of the artistic genius, and the way that Ford Madox Brown was obviously so keen on this idea and wanted all of his family to be genii. I wondered what you thought, what sort of effect that might have on a child growing up, and this idea of a genius, and that the younger brother in particular being pointed out as a genius like quite early on. That would have quite an effect, I would think.
I think so. I think that's part of the reason why when he dies, there's such a focus on him having been this precocious genius, and Ford Madox Brown really laments this sort of loss of the golden hope, the crowning glory, the boy wonder that was going to kind of change the family's fortunes, because he always had this sense that he's always sort of operating outside the establishment, and that he thinks that he's never quite achieved what he hoped to achieve, and Oliver was the designated child that was going to make that happen. And because he was like exhibiting the ability to paint at such a young age. And then he went on to write books. He writes Gabriel Denver, and then all the Madox Browns kind of, the pre-Raphaelites around them all sort of take on board that Oliver is the genius. And like, so they have the photograph of him by Hollier, and after he dies, he's put into the D&B, and he is one of the youngest entrants ever to be in the D&B. But it must have an effect on Lucy and Catherine, and they both repeat that Oliver was the genius, but that must have an inhibitive effect on your own sense of your ability. And actually Ford Madox Huffer, when he's talking about them, he actually talks about that he thought that Lucy was probably the one who had, in the fullness of time, probably had more elements of genius about her and might possibly have done great things. He's a bit disparaging of his mother's work. He sort of talks about his, just as sort of as good, but not particularly exceptional. And I find that with Ford Madox Huffer, actually it's somewhat, he does him a bit of a disservice, because he's so ambivalent about his own relationship with pre-Raphaelism that his sort of judgment of them is kind of skewed by his perception of it. And certainly for him, he feels this kind of continuing when where they sit round and Ford Madox Brown goes, you're a genius, and you're a mad genius, and I like the importance, the stress put on being a genius. I think he felt it's, and he talks about how he was called a donkey and how he wasn't, he didn't feel clever enough. And he sort of talks about the ancient lights that he talks about are people like Carlyle and Browning, and these are people that he meets because of the circles that he mixes in. He meets all these kind of the leviathans of kind of the Victorian world, and he feels the oppression that this need to kind of live up to their standards. So he certainly struggles with it.
Yeah, I can see that. It's an enormous amount of pressure, and you're sort of setting it up for either rejection or acceptance from a very early age. And yeah, I feel like psychologically that must have had a really deep effect on all the children. I think we have a question. Let me have a little look. From Peter. Peter says, thank you and congratulations, Ruth. Two tangential questions, if I may. William Waterhouse, artist father of J.W. Waterhouse, was living in Rome at the same time as FMB during the 1840s. Have you come across evidence they knew each other? That's his first question.
No, I haven't actually.
And then the second part of his question is, and have you come upon evidence of Lucy and Kathy's engagement with Laura Epps and possibly her husband Lawrence Alma Tadema in the late 1860s? Laura studied at FMB then.
Oh, so yes, because Laura becomes Alma Tadema's wife, and I think the lines of friendship there are more between Laura and Kathy. So Kathy paints a portrait of Laura after her marriage to Alma Tadema, and Alma Tadema meets Laura at Ford Madox Brown's house at a bonfire night party, something like that, and they remain friends. And then Alma Tadema actually then he paints a portrait, a bridal portrait of Frances Hofer and Cathy when they get married in 1872, so in the same year, which is in a private collection. And that's a lifelong friendship that carries on. And within the photograph album, you actually see there's photographs of Laura and Alma Tadema, and his children as well are included. So that connection, so it's not really covered within the tour, but within the exhibition, that those connections that they forge within their father's studio, where they meet these other very kind of erudite or artistically able young women, those friendships that they form in the studio, they carry on throughout their lives. And so there are later references to their kind of engagements together.
Thank you, says Peter. I actually have another question. Leading on from that, how many artists did Ford Madox Brown teach in the atelier over his lifetime? Do you know?
I don't know the number, but we do know. So there was Maurice Bartley Stillman, obviously, is one of the most famous ones. He taught Laura and Nellie Epps. Oh, certainly Ellen Epps, who was known as Nellie Epps, and possibly Laura as well. He also Georgia MacDonald, who married Burne-Jones, she also studied with him. At one point, I think Christina Rossetti even had classes with Madox Brown. And there's also Teresa Thornycroft, who was, I think, the cousin of Hamo Thornycroft, who's like the one of the new sculptors of the period. She also studies with him. And actually, I think what the catalogue for the exhibition shows is, which was written by Léa Angieux, is that it wasn't so much that Madox Brown created this, he wasn't doing anything progressive in terms of teaching female students, but what was progressive was he was allowing them to have access to kind of the standard teaching of the time. So they were able to go to, to go and study casts. And we know certainly that Lucy made a drawing of a life drawing. So she must have done a life study at a time when women were restricted from doing that kind of activity.
Right. Thank you. I think that's probably all our questions, and I think we're just up to time now. So thank you so much, Ruth. This was really, really fascinating. Really enjoyed it. Hope you all did too in the audience. This has been recorded, so it will be made available to you all in case you missed any of it. Thank you so much. I'm wishing you all a great rest of day. Take care and see you next time.
Thank you.